This is the lecture for Chapter 1, Biology, the Study of Life. When beginning any kind of science class, it is a good idea to just review the word science, what it means, and how we figure out scientific data. So the first thing, science. Science is derived from a Latin word that means to know. And the purpose of science is to explain the world around us. So science is a way to get answers to questions we have about the world. So some questions we could possibly have is, why is the sky blue? How are mountains formed? How do trees grow? And why are there so many different types of plants? So science is one way that we can get answers to these questions. The basic definition of science is that it is systematized knowledge derived from observation and experimentation. So a simpler way to say that is that science is a process of using observations and experiments to draw evidence-based conclusions. So again, another way to go through this is that science is a way to use observations and experiments to generate data or information. And then once we have generated that data, we try to organize that data, that information, into a logical order. Again, science is the process of using observation and experimentation to try to generate information, data on the natural world. And once that information is generated, then scientists try to organize it into a logical order. And this figure is an example of how scientists have organized the matter of the universe, going from the very small, the atom, and you can even go smaller, subatomic level, so that would be like the electrons, neutrons, and protons. When you put those subatomic particles together, you generate an atom. And that atom, when you put several atoms together, you generate a molecule. Several molecules together, you can generate a cell. When you put cells together, you can generate a tissue. Different tissues working together form an organ. Different organs working together form an organ system. Several organ systems working together form an organism. Several independent organisms working together form a population. Different populations, different species interacting with each other form a community, and then several different types of communities can form an ecosystem. And then all the ecosystems that we know, you put them together, you get the biosphere, which is the Earth. And actually, you can increase this even more. You can put, you can go to a higher level with the solar system. Solar system, which is a grouping of the different planets and moons, the satellites. Then you can go even higher to the galaxy. And ultimately, the highest level of organization is the universe. So this is a diagram of our world, of our universe, put together from the lowest level of organization that we know, going all the way to the highest. Now, the different areas of science cover different parts of this organization. For instance, the very small and the very large areas of science are covered by physics. So if you are interested in subatomic particles, understanding how they function, or the very large, the solar system, galaxies, and universe, you would want to study physics. Chemistry looks mainly at molecules and atoms and a little bit of subatomic particles, but chemistry focuses on that. But this class is biology, and biology covers pretty much everything from the biosphere down to the molecular level with a little bit of atoms thrown in. So biology kind of covers the middle of this organizational structure. Biology is the science of living things, and for biologists, they also try to organize all living things into a logical order. And with the assumption that all living things come from a common ancestor, they currently think that there are 3 domains. So a domain is a general grouping of living things. So those 3 domains are archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. So just a general description of these groups, the archaea, these are single-celled organisms that tend to be found in extreme environments, like very hot environments, very salty environments, very acidic environments. So you're not going to run into the archaea very often. Bacteria are also unicellular organisms, but they are found in every type of environment. So they can be found in extreme environments, but they can also be found in environments that we share. And they are even found in our bodies. And I'm sure you have heard about bacteria because many of them can cause diseases in humans. The last group are the eukarya, and the eukarya are all the other organisms. They can be unicellular, they can be multicellular, and these are the organisms we are much more familiar with. It includes plants, it includes fungi, and it includes animals, of which we are one type. Taxonomy is the word that relates to how scientists are organizing or classifying living things. And taxonomy goes beyond just the 3 domains. So scientists have developed a method by using different terms such as domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species to group organisms. And domain is the largest grouping. It is the most inclusive. And as you go down this type of classification, you are going to end up at the species classification, which is the least inclusive or the more specific. So an example for the American black bear. So the American black bear, its species name is Americanus. The genus name is Ursus. The family is Ursidae. Order is Carnivora, class is Mammalia, phylum is Chordata, kingdom is Animalia, and the domain is Eukarya. So Eukarya, one of those 3 domains. And if you look at this diagram, Eukarya contains many different types of organisms, and as you move down that classification, it gets more specific until you get to the exact species, Ursus americanus, which is specifically only the American black bear. Because of that system of taxonomy, we are able to generate scientific names for all living things. And those scientific names, we refer to them as binomial, bi to nomial name, binomial nomenclature. So every species that we discuss in science, we can use these scientific names. The scientific name for human is Homo sapien. So binomial, this is the genus name and this is the species name. Now, most of these names are derived from Latin or Greek words. And if you know the roots of the words, it tells you a lot about the name. So Homo means man, sapien means wise. So the scientific name for humans means wise man. Now, one of the things you want to notice is that the genus name is always capitalized and the species name is always lowercase. And this is something you must do when you are writing out the names, scientific names for living things. Another thing to notice is that it is italicized. So anytime you are typing the scientific name of a living thing, you need to italicize that name. If it's not possible to italicize the name, then it needs to be underlined. So this is another name for a different organism. This is Staphylococcus epidermidis. This is a type of bacteria that causes staph infections. So that is where that name comes for the infection. And this name is very descriptive. Staphylo refers to the arrangement of the cells. They're in irregular clusters. Coccus refers to the shape of the cells. That means they're round. And epidermidis tells you where it's found, its natural habitat, which is the skin. Now this name is very long, so this would be hard if you were writing a report on Staphylococcus epidermidis to write it all the time. So you can abbreviate scientific names, but the way you abbreviate them is that the genus name, you can use the first letter capitalized with a period, but then the species name, you need to write it out. So you would have to write it out epidermidis. And since I'm writing these, I can't italicize them. I would need to underline them. And this is just an example of some other scientific names for other living things that you may be familiar with. Of course, people, Homo sapiens, a lion, Panthera leo, a fly is Musca domestica, and a red maple is Acer rubrum. Rubrum, of course, is red. So all living things, whether they are an animal, a plant, a bacteria, they have been assigned a scientific name. So I've gone through how science tries to organize information about the natural world, especially in biology. But where does that information come from? So again, remember that science derives information from observation and experimentation, and that information, we call it data. Now, basically, science can be broken down into two types of processes. The first are called field studies. And field studies, basically, this involves a lot of observation. This is where you go out into the natural world and you observe what is happening. The other way to generate scientific information is by discovery science. And discovery science, this is more based on experimentation. So this is where people actually run experiments, they test out different ideas and gather data that way. So scientific information data comes from field studies and discovery science, and they often work very closely together. The scientific method is an idealized process by which scientific information or data can be generated. And the scientific method would be very involved in discovery science. This is an overall scheme for the process of the scientific method. The first thing that would happen in the idealized form of the scientific method is that the person, the scientist, would make an observation. And making an observation, this can be direct observation, something that you actually directly observe. It could be something that you read. It could be something that someone else has observed and informed you about. But all scientific method processes begin with observations. And a lot of these observations can actually come from the field studies. So once you've gathered some information, some observations, then that prompts you to ask a question. So it prompts you to ask a question. Usually this is a question that you are trying to explain what you have observed. After asking that question, then you would form a hypothesis. So you need to think of the hypothesis as a potential answer to that question that you have generated. Now, hypothesis is sometimes referred to as an educated guess. And the reason it is called an educated guess is because it's not some wild, crazy guess. You've already made a lot of observations. So you should have a pretty good idea of what the answer is. So that's why it's educated, not some kind of wild and crazy guess. It's an educated guess. But it's still a guess because you form your hypothesis before you actually do the experiment. So you don't know if it's right or not. Now, when forming a hypothesis, there are two different types of reasoning that can be used. The first type of reasoning is inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning, this is where you go from a specific observation or many specific observations to a broad generalization. So for instance, every morning you notice that the sun comes up in the east, and eventually you induce that it will always come up in the east. On a personal note, you could observe that your pizza that you're eating, that you ate last night, had anchovies on it. You didn't like that pizza, so then you induce that you don't like pizza with anchovies. So with inductive reasoning, you make the observations, you observe a pattern, and you generate the hypothesis that way. Second type of reasoning is deductive reasoning. And deductive reasoning is a little bit different. This is using general premises or general ideas to make a prediction. So, for example, you're starting here with the theory. So, a conclusion, and you're generating a hypothesis to explain a new situation. So, for instance, there's the theory, cell theory, which I will talk about a little bit later. And basically that theory says all living things are made of cells. So if all living things are made of cells and a human is a living thing, then a human must be composed of cells. So that's deductive reasoning. Another example could be dogs are carnivores. So that means that your dog must be a carnivore. So those are two different ways to get to the hypothesis. Now the next stage in the scientific method is to perform an experiment. So you need to perform an experiment, and to perform that experiment, in order to know how to set up the experiment, you need to be able to make a prediction related to the hypothesis on the experiment. So once you generate or produce the experiment, design the experiment, then you run the experiment, and that is going to generate data. So your results will be the data. Scientists use two types of data. The first type of data are qualitative data. And qualitative data are basically descriptions. And this is a lot of the type of data that is generated in field studies. The scientist is observing something occurring in the natural world, and they're writing down their description of what they're observing. Second type of data is quantitative, and quantitative comes from quantity, a number. And quantitative data are the data that are measured. So this is often what is generated during an experiment. So in an experiment, a well-run experiment, there's always something that is measured. You're measuring temperature, you are weighing things, measuring distances, measuring weight. So that is quantitative data. So quantitative data is measuring. It involves generating numbers, whereas qualitative data are more descriptions of what is occurring. With the scientific method, you begin with an observation, so something you directly observed or something that someone else has observed and you perceive that information. That leads you to asking a question about those observations, and from that you form a hypothesis, the educated guess. So educated because you have all those observations, but it's a guess because you haven't tested it yet. So once you have your hypothesis, you make a prediction based on that hypothesis, and then you design an experiment. So you design an experiment to test that prediction. You run the experiment and you analyze the results, the data that you generate. And that data can be qualitative and or quantitative. Now the two basic results you're going to get is either that the hypothesis is supported or it's not supported. Hypotheses are not proved. So just the data either supports it or doesn't support it. Either way, you need to report those results because those results are actually new observations. So if the hypothesis is not supported, then you would go back and you would modify your hypothesis. So obviously your hypothesis was incorrect for some reason. These reports, the data, the report that you generated is a new observation. So now you're going to modify your hypothesis and then test it again. If the data supported the hypothesis, that's great. But one experiment is not enough. You would want to repeat, maybe using different concentrations, different temperature, to see if it continues to support your prediction. The scientific method isn't only used by scientists to generate data, but it's a problem-solving method that we use every day. For example, you find a flashlight and you observe that it doesn't work. You click the button, it doesn't turn on. So then your question is, why does the flashlight not work? And so one example, your hypothesis could be that the batteries are dead. And this would be a very common hypothesis because probably in your experience, most of the time when a flashlight doesn't work, it's because the batteries are dead. So your prediction is that replacing the batteries will fix the problem. So you test it out, you replace the batteries, you try to turn on the flashlight, and it still doesn't work. So your hypothesis has been falsified. So this creates a new observation that it wasn't the batteries, so that's a new observation. So now you have to generate a new question. Or the question, the flashlight still doesn't work, so a new hypothesis would be it's not the batteries, it's a burned out bulb. So the prediction is if you replace the bulb, then that will fix the problem. So you test it out, you replace the bulb, the flashlight works, and now your data supports your hypothesis. So the scientific method is actually also, in regular life, a problem-solving method. The scientific method is a really good process by which to generate reliable data, but there are some limitations of this process. The first thing is that you don't prove a hypothesis. So when you are analyzing the results of your experiments, we refer to the hypothesis as being supported or not supported. So one of the things that relates to this is that the more times you perform an experiment or the more individuals you test the experiment on, the more valid your data is. Because if you perform one experiment on one individual and it supports the hypothesis, it's just supporting it, it doesn't prove it. Because just testing it once, that could just be random chance that it happened to work that one time. So when referring to the data, the more times you perform the experiment, the more data you have, the more that shows that the hypothesis is supported or not supported. The other thing about the scientific method is that it is more often going to prove what is not true. So, for example, if I tell you I'm picking a number somewhere between 1 to 100, and you are to determine, or you're going to try to find out what that number is. So you hypothesize or you predict that that number is 13. I would tell you that that is wrong. So in that instance, when you predicted that the number was 13, that was shown to be wrong, so you proved what the number isn't. So if the next time you pick 67, that's your next prediction, and I tell you that's not right, you have now proved that that isn't right. So that's kind of how science works. So we are eliminating possibilities. We are proving what is not true. The other thing about science is it cannot prove a negative. So, for instance, if your hypothesis is that pigs cannot fly, so that's your hypothesis. Pigs do not fly. So your prediction could be if you took a pig, you took it up to the top of a building, you push the pig off the building, the pig will not fly. So if you perform that experiment on the poor pig, so you take a pig up to a building, you push the pig off the building, and the pig does not fly, all you have proven is that that particular pig did not fly from that particular building. But you have not proved that all pigs cannot fly. So another limitation of science is it cannot prove a negative. It can't do that. When talking about the scientific method, it's really important to discuss the term theory. Theory is often used used in regular conversation as something that may or may not be true, something that may or may not happen. So you often hear people use it in the context of, well, maybe theoretically that might happen, theoretically that might be true. Well, in science, theory is something very different. A theory is an idea that is supported by many observations and a lot of data from experiments, so it's basically accepted as true. So in science, if something is referred to as a theory, it is pretty close to a fact. One example of a well-accepted theory is the cell theory. And cell theory is the idea that all living things on Earth are composed of cells. And if you've had any sort of science, any sort of biology before, I'm sure you accept that as true, as a fact. So all living things on Earth, anything we consider alive, is composed of cells. Another theory that I'm sure you've heard of is the theory of evolution. And the theory of evolution is used to describe how life first arose on Earth, and it also describes how we get the variety of living things that we have on Earth. And there is a lot of evidence, observation, and data recorded that support the theory of evolution. So in science, when you use the word theory, you are referring to something that is accepted as pretty much a fact. If you're referring to something that we don't know, if it is true or not, if we're still working on it, then you would say hypothetically. So a hypothesis is something that is still being tested, still being investigated. A theory is something that is pretty much accepted as true. So I've talked about science and the scientific method, and now I want to go into a more specific subset of science, and that is biology, which this class is all about. And of course, you probably know bio means life and ology refers to the study of. So this class and the rest of the semester, we're going to be looking and studying living things. Now, going through the organization of material on the Earth, which I talked about before, going from really the subatomic level all the way up to the biosphere and the universe, biology pretty much encompasses everything from the biosphere down to a little bit of the atom. And for this class focuses on cellular biology, so we really focus on the cell and the molecule and the atomic level, focusing mainly on the cell and organisms that are composed of cells. So with biology, there are many different types of living things. Bacteria, which are unicellular organisms found everywhere. We have plants. We have animals that live in the ocean, live on land, live in the air, and of course we have humans. So all of these are examples of living things, and they all share similar characteristics. All living things on Earth share the same 6 characteristics of life. And this shows you those different characteristics of life, things that all living things can do. So first, response to the environment. All living things on Earth respond to the environment. Also, they can reproduce and grow, and I kind of personally group these together as one. Also, they need to be able to process energy. They need to be able to regulate their bodies or their cells. And they also have order. And the last thing is that as a species, they are able to evolve and adapt to the environment. The first characteristic that I want to talk about is organization. Now, I've already talked about organization of things on Earth already, but when we're talking about biology and living things being organized, this also relates to that too. So with the living things that we talk about, all living things are composed of cells, and some organisms are unicellular. That means that an individual cell is an individual. The other living things are organisms, and they are composed of many cells that are organized into tissues, which are organized into organs and organ systems. But either way, there's an organization to the living things. So for example, in a human, we have cells that are neurons. This is an example of a neuron. And it's organized and structured in such a way that it can receive signals through the dendrites, and then it can send those signals out through the axons. Now, when you take, that's an individual neuron cell that has a certain organization which relates to its function. When you take a lot of these neurons together, then you can end up with a brain. And the brain has different areas that have different functions. Then when you organize that brain with other organs and tissues, you can end up with a nervous system. And the whole nervous system is organized to take stimuli input from the body, transmit it to a processing center, which will process that information and then send out a signal, a response. So for instance, if you touch a hot pan, even before you consciously think of it, that information of the hot pan that could burn your hand has been transmitted to your brain, and your brain, because of the structure, the organization, the function, it can send the signal to have you automatically move your hand away to prevent the burn, to prevent damage. So the organization of the cells, how the cells function, how the tissues function, the organ function, leads to the function of the organism. The second characteristic of living things is metabolism. And metabolism has two parts, and the first part is that organisms, living things, need building blocks. So building blocks to make new molecules, which are used to make organelles, which can be used to make new cells if it's a multicellular organism. So the building blocks that we use to make new molecules are basically atoms. Atoms. And living things cannot create atoms. We can't destroy atoms. So we actually need to recycle the atoms that are on the earth. And one example of this is the carbon cycle. So carbon, our molecules are carbon-based molecules. So we need, every living thing needs a lot of carbon. And again, we cannot create the carbon. We have to recycle the carbon. So with the carbon cycle, you have carbon dioxide in the air. Plants take in the carbon dioxide, they convert it to glucose, and then the animals eat the plants to get the glucose. And then as that glucose is utilized for energy, the carbon is released back into the air in the form of carbon dioxide. Or if the carbon was used to produce structures for the animals, when they die, they are broken down by fungi and other decomposers, and then it's released into the air. So metabolism, this metabolism of photosynthesis, cellular respiration, is used to get building blocks, get the carbon dioxide for the living things. And it's not just carbon dioxide. Every type of atom has its cycle. There's a nitrogen cycle, there's a phosphorus cycle, there's a sulfur cycle. So metabolism, this type of metabolism, is used for every type of atom that is required for every type of molecule that living things use. So the second characteristic, metabolism, is involved in building blocks and then also energy. So it's very important for all living things to have a source of energy. And with this is the idea of the flow of energy, how energy moves through an ecosystem. So all the energy that all living things use originally comes from the sun. Plants or other photosynthetic organisms are able to harvest that light energy and convert it into glucose. So it converts it into glucose, and when the animals ingest the plants, then they take in that energy, and then they can use cellular respiration to convert it into ATP, which is the readily usable energy. So this is the flow of energy. Energy flows from the sun, it goes through the process of photosynthesis, then through cellular respiration, and then as that ATP is used, that energy is released as heat into the environment. Heat is released into the environment. Energy cannot be recycled. So that's why this is called the flow of energy. It only moves in one direction. The third characteristic that living things share is homeostasis. And homeostasis is basically the ability of the organism to regulate its cellular processes, or if it's a multicellular organism, its body processes. So homeo means similar, stasis means standing. One example of regulation or homeostasis is body temperature. So I'm sure you have experienced this, but if your body temperature falls, if you're getting colder, your body is going to do things to try to increase the temperature. So your blood vessels are going to constrict to conserve heat, and you will also start shivering to generate body heat. So hopefully what that does is that you retain the heat, you generate heat, and you go back to a normal body temperature. If instead your body temperature is rising, it's increasing, then your blood vessels are going to dilate to help release some of that energy. You're going to sweat so that as that sweat evaporates, it's going to cool the body, and hopefully your body temperature decreases so you go back to normal body temperature. So that's homeostasis, maintaining a constant body temperature. And you have to do that so that your cells can function normally. Another example of homeostasis is maintaining a constant water content, and fish that live in either fresh water or marine water, they have to be able to regulate the concentration of water in their bodies. And when a fish lives in fresh water, a lot of water tends to diffuse into the fish. So the fish, they regulate with their kidneys, and they secrete a lot of water in their urine because so much water is diffusing into their bodies. Marine fish have the opposite problem. With marine fish, since they live in salt water, they tend to dehydrate so water can leave their bodies. So often their urine is highly concentrated to prevent losing water that way. So homeostasis is similar standing. It's regulating the bodies of the different organisms to maintain a consistent environment so their cells can function. The fourth characteristic that living things share is that they are able to respond to the environment, and that's with animals and plants. You probably know that plants respond to light and they grow towards the light. So even if the pot is tipped over, assuming the light is coming from the top, the plants, instead of growing straight out from the pot, they will angle towards the light. And not only do they grow towards the light, the leaves grow towards the light, but roots tend to grow towards gravity. They grow down in response to gravity. Now, plants aren't the only organisms that are able to respond. Animals, of course, respond also, and they can respond to the environment, changes in temperature, maintain that homeostasis, but also they can respond to each other. So male peacocks, they put their feathers out to attract a female, and then the female, of course, is responding to the visual display of the male peacock. So that's an important characteristic, that living things are able to respond to the environment, which may include other individuals as well. The fifth characteristic that all living things share is reproduction and development, and I put these two together because they're very closely related. Reproduction. So all living things are able to reproduce. So unicellular organisms, one cell, will be able to divide to form two individuals. So that's basic cellular reproduction. So that's a unicellular organism. Multicellular organisms also reproduce. So they also reproduce, but we don't go from one identical person to another identical person, just like cell division. Instead, in order for multicellular organisms to reproduce, there's also development. The cells have to develop. So in human development, we all start as one single cell, a fertilized egg, and then that cell goes through cellular division, very similar to this, but the cells aren't just increasing in number, they're developing and specializing. So overall, as you go through the process of human development, you get specialization of the cells, which leads to tissues, which leads to organs, organ systems, and then of course a fully functioning multicellular individual. So reproduction and development, this involves cells reproducing, so cells dividing, but also the organism itself developing and specializing. The last characteristic that living things share is that they are able to adapt to the environment. And this really refers to the species adapting to the environment over time. So it's how species specialize to live in their particular environment. And that's basically the idea of natural selection. So you have some foxes that have adapted to living in the Arctic. They are white, so they blend in with the snow. They have very small ears to conserve heat and also very thick fur to keep them warm. While other foxes have adapted to the desert, they're brown so that they blend in with the dirt. They have very large ears to help with releasing heat, and their fur is not as thick. So these are two related species who have adapted to two different environments. And of course, the idea of natural selection was first proposed by Darwin when he looked at the finches, different species of finches on the Galapagos Islands, and he correlated their beak size with the type of food that was available on each of the islands. So he saw that the different species of finches adapted to the type of food that was available for them on those islands. So all living things, no matter if they're bacteria, plants, animals, humans, they share 6 characteristics of life. They're all able to respond to the environment. They can reproduce and develop. They can metabolize, process energy to get nutrients, building blocks, and also energy. They can regulate their bodies, perform homeostasis to maintain function. They have order in their cells, where their cells, their tissues perform specific functions, and they are able to adapt to the environment. In addition to those characteristics of life, there are 2 requirements for life. So when I say requirements for life, 2 characteristics that things must have to be considered living things on Earth. The first requirement for life is cellular structure. And I already mentioned this with the cell theory. All living things are composed of cells. They can be composed of an individual cell, and an individual organism like a bacterium is composed of 1 cell, or they could be composed of many cells, and that would be a multicellular organism. But all living things on Earth have cellular structure. The other requirement for life on Earth is to have DNA. All living things have DNA, which composes their genes, which controls the cell. It's the molecule of information that tells the cell what molecules it will produce and what sort of function it will have. So on Earth, all living things must have cellular structure, and they must have DNA as the molecule of information. This was an introductory chapter just going over some basic information on science, the scientific method, biology, the characteristics of life, and requirements for life. Now the rest of the semester we are going to focus on the cell. So most of the information is going to be focused on the cell, cellular structure, and cellular function. We will talk a little bit about atoms and molecules, basically about how they come together to form the different parts of the cell and how they're needed for cellular function.